Hey guys, welcome back to my CCNA 20301 course. In this video, we'll be continuing our discussion about configuration and troubleshooting commands of spanning tree protocol. Are you ready? Let's get started. The first command I want to show you today changes the interface cast in a spanning tree protocol infrastructure, which can manipulate the root port selection, for example. If you want to change an interface cast, like many other configuration options in a spanning tree, this is happening per VLAN, because if you remember that I mentioned that a spanning tree protocol and also RSTP or rapid spanning tree protocols have been implemented per VLAN, which is PVST plus or RPVST plus in Cisco switches. So if you want to change an interface cast, you have to decide about which VLANs or VLAN you want to have this cast for. To change the cast, you go to the interface, you pick your interface or interfaces and say spanning tree and then VLAN, and then pick your VLAN or VLANs, for example VLAN 1 to 10, and then cast, and then pick the right cast you have in your mind for this interface or multiple interfaces you have selected. Obviously, when you change this value, you have to be very careful because it may change your spanning tree protocol topology. The next set of commands I'm going to talk about are optional commands of a spanning tree protocol or optional features of a spanning tree protocol that you don't have to configure them, and normally they are disabled by default. The first optional feature is called PortFast. PortFast in PVST plus, when you have the slower version, can help you to connect your endpoint devices faster, because endpoint devices will not create any loop in our network. We can bypass those two listening and learning steps of PVST plus. This feature is kind of built in Rapid PVST plus, so you don't need it if you have Rapid PVST plus configured on your switches, and it is useful only with PVST plus. So in case you have endpoint devices or on the interfaces that are connected to endpoint devices or like workstation, servers, etc., you can configure PortFast. So ignore those two listening and learning steps, which actually awaits the client or endpoint for 30 seconds minimum. You have two options when it comes to configure these optionals mostly. The first one is globally configure these options by default on all interfaces. And obviously, in case you don't want to have this feature on a specific interface, you have to disable it on those interfaces. To enable PortFast by default on all interfaces, in global configuration mode, we say spanning tree and then PortFast and then default. On this specific switch that has been emulated in EventG for me, I have to add another option as well, which is Edge and then default. But in Cisco switches, mostly the layer 2 and layer 3 switches that we normally use as the endpoint and kind of devices that are going to be connected at access layer, the command is spanning tree PortFast default, and this command will enable PortFast by default on all interfaces. If you want to enable PortFast on individual interfaces, obviously you have to pick your interface or interfaces, and then in your interface you say spanning tree PortFast, and this command will enable PortFast on that individual interface or multiple interfaces you have selected through interface range command, for example. This command is for enabling PortFast on access ports. If you have trunk ports and you still want to have PortFast-enabled on them, which might be connected to a server that has virtualization environment running on it, so there might be multiple VLANs on that server that is coming through that individual interface, and then you want to have PortFast-enabled on that port that is connected to that server, for example. In that case, you say spanning tree, PortFast, and then trunk. But in this emulated device, I still need to have edge added to my command. So I can say spanning tree, PortFast, edge, trunk. But on your devices, on the Catalyst switches, it's a spanning tree, PortFast, trunk, or a spanning tree, PortFast for access ports. The next set of commands are related to two features that are called BPDU Guard and BPDU Filter. BPDU Guard is actually kind of more restrictive in compared to BPDU Filter. BPDU Guard basically means, hey switch, if you receive any BPDU packet on this interface, it is restricted and it is forbidden. So if you receive such a thing, by default, the reaction is putting the interface in error disabled mode and shut it down. So you kind of protect your network from unwanted switches. But for BPDU filter, you basically disable spanning tree protocol on your interface. So you have to be careful about BPDU filter when you use that feature. When I'm saying you disable STP on your interface, it means that that interface will not send spanning tree protocols outside, and it will not receive or filter the incoming BPDU packets as well. If you want to use these features, again, it is optional to have it configured globally on all interfaces by default, or do it on individual interfaces. For BPDU Guard, globally on your switch, you have to go to global configuration mode and you have to say a spanning tree and then PortFast. And then on this switch, I have to add the edge option, but you don't have to in Cisco Catalyst switches. And then you say BPDU Guard and then default. This command will enable BPDU Guard on all interfaces. Similar for BPDU Filter. You can enable BPDU Filter by default on all interfaces. And similarly, on individual interfaces, when you pick your interface, you can say spanning tree, BPDU Guard, enable, or disable it on any interface if you want to. And also spanning tree, BPDU Filter, and then enable or disable. When you have designed your spanning tree topology and you designated specific switches to become root primary and the other one to become root secondary, you definitely don't want to have an intruder to change this spanning tree topology, either intentionally, like a hacker or someone else, or unintentionally by a user that, for example, connects an unwanted switch to your network. To prevent any other switches to send superior hellos to your interfaces, I mean to switch interfaces, there is a feature that is called root guard. And if you enable this feature on your switch interfaces, no superior hellos will be allowed on those interfaces. And if any other switches wants to become the root, they won't allow it, and they won't allow that superior BPDU goes through the network. This feature is only configurable on individual interfaces, and you cannot globally enable it on all interfaces. So if you want to enable this feature, you have to go to your interface or interfaces and then say spanning tree guard root, and this will enable root guard on your interface or interfaces. The final feature I want to talk about is called loop guard. It is normally happening when we have unidirectional link failure. I mean, for example, if in this scenario, switch 1 is our root bridge, and these are the root ports, this one and this one, and let's assume that the link has been blocked from here. But for whatever reason, the link fails, which normally happens with fiber connections. So the link actually fails in one direction only. So our switch 2, will not receive BPDUs anymore from switch 1. But the thing is, the link is connected in the other way, and it just fails in one way or one direction. So in these circumstances, switch 2 or a spanning tree on switch 2 will react and then enable this interface, and then enabling this interface can cause a loop in the network because this link is still active in one direction. So if the traffic comes from this way, it will be able to rotate in our network and create a rule. The only trick about the loop guard is loop guard and root guard cannot be enabled simultaneously on interfaces. So you have to pick between loop guard and root guard. We can configure loop guard like some other features we have spoken globally and also on individual interfaces. If you want to enable it globally, you have to go to global configuration mode and you have to say spanning tree, loop guard, and then default. And this will enable loop guard on all interfaces by default. And if you want to do it on individual interfaces, you have to pick your interface or interfaces, and you have to say spanning tree, guard, and then loop to enable interfaces. So if I do this, and again, if I say spanning tree, guard, root, and if we go and have a look at the interface gig 01 in the running config, you can see that the last command is being implemented, which is guard root, but not guard loop. So you can either pick guard loop or guard roots on your interfaces. Show spanning tree summary command will help us to figure out these features that have been globally, if these features have been globally configured on our switches. So if you have enabled PortFast by default on all interfaces, you would see is enabled here. Likewise for BPDU Guard, BPDU Filter, and loop guard features. So for example, if I go to global configuration mode and if I say spanning tree, loop guard default, and then run show spanning tree summary again, you can see that loop guard default now changed its status to enabled. And if you want to verify individual interface configurations, show run interface gig 01, for example, is useful to figure out which optional feature of a spanning tree is configured on your interface. If you have multiple interfaces, you can go through multiple interfaces. All right, guys, this was our today's video. In the upcoming video, I'll be talking about wireless networks. I wish you enjoyed today's video and see you in the next ones.